should be a short and sweet one showing some current jobs related to Gibson headstock fractures that are, if not out of the ordinary, then maybe different from stuff I've already shown. There's bound to be some extra noise this week because I've got the furnace running full blast and my humidifier and everything, because it's the dead of winter. What I'd like the takeaway to be is there are a number of different approaches that I employ to headstock brakes. They're not all the same, and intuition plays a part in how I tackle the job. Also, I think it's important to remember that these are methods which I use, and other people have their own way of doing it. It can be completely different. I think the goal is to have a strong, stable repair, and you can reach that through many different paths, all kinds of different means. And I always emphasize that at the end of the day, if you drop a Gibson again, chances are it's going to re-break. It's very, very difficult to overcome the inherent fragility of this design. I sometimes hear people say, well, I've dropped mine a dozen times and it stays together, and to which I respond, what is wrong with you that you're that careless with the valuable thing that allows you to express yourself musically? Most people think of these as important musical companions, and they're not dropping them. Here's a late 1960s Gibson SG, SG Special, I guess, because it's got the P90s in it. At some point, long ago, the current owner's father tripped over it and cracked the headstock right in two. Now, he effected a repair himself using an unknown adhesive, and it was okay for a while, but it opened up again on the exact same line, which isn't great. And I told the owner that, because it's tricky to glue a previously glued surface because it's got glue on it and it's sealed up, and the irregular contours and texture of broken mahogany make it virtually impossible to clean off properly. Add to that, it was a fairly tight crack. Like the headstock didn't fall right apart, but it was open and smiling a little bit. And that gave me hope that if I used a high solids epoxy and really got in there, it might have a chance. So I did that. It closed up really nicely. Did a little bit of finish touch up and made it pretty. Strung it up and it was fine again. And I came back several hours later and it was open. So also in exactly the same place. I wasn't sure if I was going to film this one, to be honest, because it had the potential to be a very boring sort of repair. But now that this has happened, I guess I will. It's a unique kind of annoyance because you have to do it all over, and it gets harder every time. So I've decided to do a half backstrap overlay, which would give me much more surface area for the glue to hold onto. And to that end, I've used a bunch of super glue in there to hold it back in place temporarily while I route the wood off. So I got my jig. Yes, this is a different jig. No, it's not new. I have so many of these things because every job is different, and every time I have to modify it in some way. And this is one of the early efforts at making sort of a universal jig. It's rough and not attractive like a repair jig should be. It's got this hinged portion here, designed to give me better purchase against the high angle of the headstock. In later jigs I realized I didn't really need that. But the hole in this one is about the right size. Put a little shim in it there. And it's got a fairly tall prop at this end, so the plug that I'm going to be cutting is going to be fairly parallel with the back surface of the neck itself, rather than sort of splitting the difference between the angles of the headstock and the neck like I often do, or you've seen me do in the past. Realize there's only about 2.5 millimeters of wood in this area here that I can take away because it's hiding the truss rod cavity. It's just under the surface there. So I'm going to get this plotted out. I'm going to clamp it in place on the headstock. I'm going to put some masking tape on here and also on the jig. This is padded with cork so it's not going to dent the neck. And I'm going to super glue the masking tapes together to give me fairly strong contact. Let's take out the half moon washer because it's not a good idea to run a router bit into that. I'll route this in a couple of shallow passes because it's not a great idea to try and hog off huge amounts of wood in this area, and also it's still kind of tenuously held together with the super glue. That's the first pass. I'll go in another millimeter or so. There are a couple of little artifacts at the end of the cut there, left over from the circular nature of the router bit in my template, which I'll get rid of using a chisel. Here we have an early 50s Gibson LG1, which is in similar condition. Glued up okay, but it's a fairly short break, and the front side is pretty ragged looking. So I'd like to inlay something over top of this to both bolster the joint from the front side and get rid of this really kind of nasty business. So I'll route off the front side from the second set of holes here up to the nut area. Back to the SG. I extended the end of the routed section so it runs up to the surface of the back of the neck in sort of a gentle arc. This might look better than having a straight line where the inlay is set into the cutout. And to fit that curve, I have to mate the two surfaces. To do that, I use some fine grit double stick sandpaper stuck directly to the surface. I'll use that to show the high spots, then scrape and sand those down till I get a good fit. It took a while, but I got there. I'm using a generous quantity of glue here, especially on the end grain section. End grain is supposed to have very little strength as a glue surface. However, I've seen practical experiments from various people. Matthias Vondel on YouTube here did one recently, last year or so, which kind of contradict that. Apparently end grain is a better bonder than we give it credit for. Anyway, I want to give it a fighting chance, but most of the strength will come from the long grain. I'll get those two surfaces mated and then use a bunch of clamps and a bunch of corked cawls to hold things together. Back to the LG. Here's one of my front side routing jigs. This registers off the front face of the headstock, gets clamped down with these padded things here. There's also a cutaway in this area because this has to travel over the intersection of the nut and the fingerboard, which is like a 1/4 of an inch thick or so. So that accounts for the fingerboard, basically. It rides over it, so there's good support all the way up to the nut area. I use a small machinist square to register the front wall of the jig with the line of the nut. The bit I'm using is a hinge mortising design. It's fairly short, so I can use it with the 3/4 inch plywood of my jig and still take a very shallow cut. I'll lower the bit until it just touches the surface of the headstock and move it around to see if I need to adjust the angle to account for slight inconsistencies in the plane of the headstock due to the reglue, etc. In this case, I needed a wedge to lift the front just a little bit. It was going to cut too deep. I want an even cut of just over 1 millimeter in depth. Again, this is one of those things that you want to have some practice with before trying it out on a guitar, because the forces involved by the rotation of that bit can be surprising until you've worked with it. After a while, it becomes intuitive. I pare it away so that it's just clearing the end of the truss rod. Again, we don't want to run the router into that steel. That would be bad. That's a nice clean surface. I need to plane the inlay to rough thickness. In this case, I'm using pear wood, which is strong and it has closed grain pores, so it won't need filling. I think the headstock in this case was just painted. Other more expensive Gibsons had a headstock overlay made of holly veneer. Pear is more stiff at these dimensions, so I think it's a good choice. I've trimmed it to rough shape and exact length, and it's ready to glue. I'm using some paste wax on the truss rod threads. Glue shouldn't get on there, but, just in case. Gluing the front overlay is essentially the same as a back strap, but the shape necessitates a little cutout on the caul on the backside so that I can put clamps right up against the area of the nut. It sort of overhangs a bit there. After a couple of days worth of drying time, I'm ready to trim the overlay with some sharp carving knives. This is kind of the fun part of the project for me. I'll scrape and sand so that it's flush with the rest of the headstock. When this broke, there was some wood loss and also loss of flaky finish, leaving gaps and a generally ugly appearance, so I'll use some 2-part epoxy putty. Quickwood is the brand name. The tool is a cuticle cleaner my wife donated to the cause. It's brand new. It's never scooped overgrown cuticle, in case you're worried. This stuff works very well. It carves and sands nicely, and it's very stable. There's a tremendous amount of sanding involved in one of these projects, and after the first sanding I'll have to wet the wood, let it dry, and sand it again. I'll re-expose the hidden beauty of the truss rod cavity. For a base coat, I'm just going to stain the raw pear with some India ink. You're not going to see this, but if the lacquer ever chips off in the future, it will look more authentic. Okay, let's see if we can hide this line of tragedy and make it less evident. Ooh, I almost forgot. There's this really big gash in the back of the neck, and also several places where an old screw-type capo really did a number. It was grinding off the finish and leaving marks up and down the center line. So I'll put some putty on that. The rest I'll soften with a couple of coats of lacquer. We're not trying to make this thing look new by any means. I sprayed on a coat of lacquer, and then 10 minutes later I'll go in with these fresco powders in various brown tones and start to obscure the line of the break. This is Blendall Powder Stain, which is a very finely ground pigment. It does shift color slightly when you activate it with more lacquer on top, so there's a bit of guesswork or trial and error involved. These are very expensive. A full set would cost more than an Indonesian Fender Squier, so probably out of reach for the hobbyist, and they kind of discourage anyone who's not in a refinishing trade from buying them. Here I'm spraying a coat of black opaque lacquer on the overlay. You can see I made sort of an arch of masking tape over the logo, which protects it, and it also creates a fuzzy line between the old and new. I'm just going to show a little bit of the carving work on the SG. I won't get it done here because, well, there's a lot of painting to do. And I've shown this on a number of different headstock videos, even on some SGs, so it's out there if you want to go digging. And on the LG, I'm not going to do a full level and buff out like you see me do sometimes. The original surface on this guitar is very thin. It's completely checked, which is that crackle pattern you see on old lacquer surfaces after they dry out. It's kind of pebbly, so it doesn't really make sense to, smooth it to perfect shine. I'm going to lightly score in some faux checking onto the headstock here, referring to the crackle patterns I see on the body for reference. But this is mostly to take off the newness. I'll rub it with a paper towel and some shop dust too, and scuff it down a little bit. Just give it a light weathering and make it less obvious. This came with some funny looking Japanese replacement tuners from the 1970s. But the owner has some golden age ones, which don't really look original either, but they're better, so we'll put those on. And they don't require larger holes in the headstock, which is a plus. There we have it. It's not a forgery, but it doesn't look like a broken guitar from across the room anymore. It's a reasonable, cost-effective repair. So I'm kind of groaning in disgust. This is a guitar that I couldn't really evaluate fully when it arrived, of course, because it was in two pieces. After all that, I string it up to find that the action is, it's like 9/64. There's enough saddle for me to kind of bring it into sort of playable, but I want you to have a look at this high E string. See how close to the edge of the board that is? It's running out beyond the bevel on the fret ends down low, and by the time you reach the top end of the board, it's running completely off the edge. And that's because someone got happy with the carpenter's glue and fixed it real professional-like. There's this real generous dollop of squeeze out all the way around, which would have taken about 30 seconds to clean up when it was fresh. Now, probably hours. But the main thing is, it's in the wrong place. The other thing is, with string tension, I can see that the top has come loose from the tail block. Gotta fix that. Can't leave it. It's going to tear the thing apart. And, the customer wants me to install a pickup, but this stuff has to get done. For me, the amount of work I just put into the headstock, it doesn't make sense not to do it right, And the issue is that's another full day's worth of work I got to squeeze into an already full schedule. This happens again and again when we're dealing with the old guitars. One of the problems masks all the others. Occasionally there are people out there who will complain about how long it takes to get a guitar back from their neighborhood master luthier. But, if you find someone who's working on these old guitars, they're all like this. So a carefully crafted schedule immediately starts to fall apart, and it quickly gets kind of exponentially worse. So I'm going to call it here because I want to edit this thing and put this video out. And I can't really play very much on this one because, you know, I can't tune it up fully. Maybe we'll do it for a minute and see what happens. Okay, I've tuned it up to C, figuring that would be pretty safe. And quickly discovered that this saddle is in definitely the wrong location. The intonation is quite suspect. It's about 20 cents sharp. But it's kind of sort of playable. Alright, we'll see you guys soon.